In this video, we're going to take an overview look at the Materials Manager and creating materials within Cinema 4D. We're going to look at all the different channels that we have access to, some of the built-in shaders that are provided, and also some of the specialized surfaces and other effects that we can add to our materials to build up a really impressive texture library. So here I've just got a simple sphere in my scene, and I'm just going to double click to begin the process of creating a new material. So the first channel that we have access to here is of course the color channel, and so I can use the color slider to pick a color. I can click on the drop down to get different options for types of sliders. I can double click in here to pull up a floating panel. I can also use the texture drop down field to choose, for example, if I wanted to load in a texture image, or if I want to use one of the shaders built into Cinema 4D. Also, we have some specialized surfaces. Depending on what version of Cinema 4D you have, you'll have access to many of these different options as well. And we're going to be looking at several of these surfaces in this process. But so for right now, for this color, I'm going to use a Fresnel. And a Fresnel shader is typically used in the reflection, what used to be the reflection, now the reflectance channel. And it determines how a reflection is cast on a surface, especially on a surface like this where you might have less reflection in the center and then increase reflection as it goes around the curved surfaces of the object. And so I don't want this color configuration for my Fresnel. So in this case, I'm using the Fresnel just to give me a kind of a cool gradient effect around from the center generating out. And so I'm going to set a couple colors here. And drop that on to my sphere. You can see how that works. And if I turned off reflectance, so it looks like this, I might raise this a little bit brighter, and maybe this a little bit brighter as well. So without a reflectance, which we'll talk about in a minute, I have no light bounce off the surface, so I just get the true color here, and that's what we're looking at in this case. Then we have the diffusion channel, which allows us to add dark areas into the surface, so how light is absorbed or bounced off the surface. And so we'll use this one in just a moment. Luminance, so if I wanted to make this material luminant, and if I come in and were to create just do it standard, but add global illumination, this will actually cast light. So if I had a big cube here, that engulfed my scene, depending on how bright this luminance was, and that's actually controlled under luminance. So really ramp up the strength. I might actually get some light generated from this surface. So you can actually see now I'm lighting up the box. So these are kind of some of our extra parameters here. And this really only comes into play when you're dealing with global illumination, and it is tied to the luminance channel. So I can raise this above 100% to make it brighter here as well. The problem is you can wash out your colors that way, so sometimes it's better to rely on the generate GI value to create that effect, but here you can see actually lighting with the luminance channel. Other times you may not want to be using global illumination, so you can create materials in this luminance channel, and oftentimes if you're trying to create something like a screen, you would obviously want to use luminance because you don't want any shadows and things cast onto a lit surface. So luminance is very popular for that, and also of course for generating geometric lights in Cinema 4D. And so as you can see here, I don't need the color channel if I have luminance enabled, depending on what kind of blend I'm wanting to do across from the color to luminance. Then we have the transparency, and I'm going to get rid of my cube here. Now right now this would just show up as black, so I'm going to create a sky object, and let's look at the content browser. In the prime settings you have some HDRI images, so I'm just going to create a second material and go to the luminance channel of this material and drag in my HDRI image. And so another good use of the luminance channel is in creating HDRI lighting environments. So now with the transparency enabled, instead of black, I see through the object and just pick up the background that I've placed. So reason being is because I have a brightness of 100% and a refraction of 1, which means it's completely transparent, and with a refraction of 1, the light is not getting bent at all as it passes through. There's no distortion. If I begin to add refraction values here, you can see my preview update. And now if I would render this, I'm going to start to get a warp where light is bending through that surface. And so depending on what kind of transparent material you're building, you can actually look up refraction values of different things such as glass, etc. And there's also some built-in shaders in Cinema 4D that we'll look at in the shader video that allow you to create different kinds of transparent materials as well. So you have tons of flexibility on how transparency works. One more important option here is the blurriness value. So again, if I'm creating different kinds of surfaces, so maybe a frosty type mug effect, then we might want to add some blurriness. This is a high level of blurriness, so you'll see that you really lose any sense of imagery through the surface. I can dial that down to half, and let me turn on. This will be a lower quality preview, but still be able to see how this starts to bring in the actual colors. And then, just as you'll see in many cases, you'll have sample values. Of course, the higher the sample values, the better the quality is going to be. So you can see how that tremendously slows down the render, and that's one thing to keep in mind when you're building materials. The killers are reflections and transparencies. They can really, especially blurred reflections and transparencies, can really slow down your render times. And so we'll talk about some of the ways that you can kind of cheat those effects as we go through the process. But you can just get some amazing looking textures. So this is the transparency channel. Then we have the new reflectance channel, and we have an entire video dedicated to the reflectance channel, so I'm just going to cover it really quickly. So this replaces the color channel again. So this replaces the specular and reflection channels from Cinema 4D in the past. And so what you have by default, you just have a specular surface. You don't have a reflection enabled, and you can quickly add a reflection surface, and it'll ask you to choose a type of surface. So is it a diffuse surface, basically your color? You don't even have to have a color channel when you use reflectance at times. You have legacy values, so these are your materials that would carry over from previous versions, and then some new models. So I could choose GGX, for example. By default, it comes in 100% reflective, which, just like we saw with the transparency, it overrides all color values. So in order to have this work with the texture, you can change the attenuation to additive, and now it's working with the underlying color. One more note about transparency. If I enable this here, now we're double dosing on some high render time values with reflection and transparency. But one thing we didn't mention is this additive option here. So if I do want it to more correlate with the color values, I can click on additive, and now you'll see that those two are working closer together. So I'm actually picking up the color from the color channel and still generating the transparency value as well. So in reflectance, it's not additive, it's the attenuation type that allows you to determine how your reflection is dealing with the color channel. All right, we talked about cheats. The environment channel is just one of these cheats, so don't have reflection enabled anymore, but I still want to get kind of a nice material, the look of a reflection. The environment channel allows me to load in an image, so I can load in that same HDRI image, and here I can lower the strength. So if I wanted to, there's two ways to do this. If I wanted to put some color in here, maybe I wanted to make it a little bit of a green reflection. This mix strength is talking about how it mixes with the color value at the top. So I could lower that. The other thing I could do is just lower the brightness if I did not want to have, if I wanted this to be not as strong, I could lower that brightness value. And then I can even get the blurry reflections. Oops. Yeah, by raising my blur offset. So now I'm getting a nice blurred reflection without any of the slowdown that comes with a blurred reflection in a true physical reflection. Then we have the fog, and fog works, it's actually generated inside the objects. And so this allows you to add some, this will be very slow. This allows you to create environment inside your shapes. Let me turn off interactive render region for a moment. So if I were to place, let's just place a cube in here and make my, okay, so And here, if I raise the distance 9,000, now we begin to see our object. So you're able to create an atmosphere here, and the distance value will weaken. The higher the number, it will weaken the density of the fog. So it really is for containing your shapes within an atmosphere. Let me just add one more shape in here that's further away. Tell if that's outside of my shape or not. Make my sphere a little bit larger. And so you can see how you can get that depth cue in using the fog environment channel. And again, it goes inside the shape. Just back up here before I change that size. So then we have the bump channel. I'm going to turn my color back on. So the bump channel works to create depth within your materials, but it does it. It's a cheat. It doesn't actually change the dimensions of your geometry. There's no push or pull that actually takes place. And for this, I'm going to use, let's say, pavement. And so it works on grayscale values. So good chance to show you the layer shader. And so the layer shader allows me, I can have anything loaded in here, choose the layer shader, it'll just create what was there as a layer within there. And now I can add another shader on top of this. So maybe it's a filter, and could have just done all this in here, but that's okay. So I choose colorize. It's going to turn that into grayscale. So I don't even need this layer. And so with the grayscale value, I'm just going to turn this up. I'm going to see that begin to show up here. Turn back my interactive render region back on. And so we get this illusion of depth. The white areas are going to pull out, the black areas will push in. I'm going to push this a little bit further. And let me go ahead and turn on global illumination. And so you can see how that looks. Now, if this were an editable object, so let me duplicate this. And I'm going to turn the subdivisions way up and change it to a hexahedron. Set a pretty high value there. Don't need the render perfect, and I'll make this editable. So when this renders, which will take a little bit longer now because I've raised the subdivision level so far. So one thing you can see, and probably could see better if I did a couple things here. Let me set up a compositing tag and turn off seen by cameras. It'll still give us reflections if we choose to add those, and we'll still light our scene. And I'm actually just going to render this to the picture viewer. And what you'll see is that it's not, as I said, pushing in or pulling out the geometry. If you look at the edges of your shape, they're going to be smooth. So it kind of gives itself away depending on how you look at the surface. So you can see the edge of the surface is still smooth. There's no real geometry getting pushed around there. And so this is a great effect for creating depth and doing it cheap. It renders fast, it still looks great, and especially with things like ambient occlusion enabled, which brings some nice shadows into these cracks and crevices, it's a really good looking option. When you need a real deformation of the surface, you'll choose the displacement option, and we'll just go ahead and look at that now. So I'm going to copy channel, enable displacement, and paste channel. And so you can see in the preview, I am now actually pushing and pulling around that geometry. And right now it's set to 5 centimeters, so we're not getting a huge deformation. If I turn this up to 25, we should really begin to see something in our render. So now you see we're actually really pulling around on the mesh and creating a real deformation. One thing you will notice is that in some of these areas it's really stretched. It's having a tough time getting enough geometry to pull the surfaces, and that's where subpolygon displacement comes in, which allows me to basically, it's almost like the subdivision surfaces option here. It imitates a higher subdivision level and produces much better results. So I'm going to render this to the picture viewer so we can see it. And this is a very useful option for when you're bringing in characters. So for example, when you do work in ZBrush, you may be working at a much higher resolution as you make the displacement map, and then when you want to bring that into Cinema 4D, you can lower the actual geometric subdivision level of your character mesh to a low value, use the Go Z, or just export the model out of ZBrush, and then when you bring that material, when you bring that displacement map into Cinema 4D, you can enable the subdivision subpolygon displacement option here, and then set the subdivision level to whatever the difference is in the levels of subdivisions between your high resolution mesh in ZBrush and your low resolution mesh. So if you had 7 subdivision levels, and that's where you created your final piece, and you export your lowest, your subdivision level 1, you can bring in that high quality displacement map, set your subdivision level to 6, and you'll end up with a render that looks very similar to your really high resolution mesh. So that's displacement. I'll let this render and we can look at it in a moment. The other options, normal mapping is kind of the in-between the bump channel and the displacement channel, and it allows you to use multiple values. It's kind of a higher level value than the bump channel, and again doesn't take the render time of displacement, and so we'll actually look at that when we talk about using ZBrush and third-party softwares come in. I'll actually go through using the normal map. Alpha is one that's very important, and we can look at building a material. You can see the difference between, still rendering here, between the bump channel and a really high resolution displacement channel anyway. Hide that. So the alpha channel allows you to do some really cool stuff. So I'm going to enable alpha channel, and I'm going to load another surface here. So I'm going to go to tiles and choose, let's see, maybe circles. And I'm going to change these circles to be white. And black. So the alpha, just like an alpha channel, a mask, and any program looks at black and white values. Oops, I want that one to stay white. So it's a mixture of these options, and you can see kind of what's going on here. And so you can see in my render what's happening here as the alpha channel is rendering. I've got the background, so you're actually seeing through the sphere where the alpha channel is taking place. Now invert this, and we'll have kind of a wiffle ball effect here. And I'll show you something really cool about this. So I'm going to turn off my sky background. I'm going to add a light. And I'm going to turn off GI for right now. Don't need it. So right now the light is illuminating the inside of my sphere. I'm going to set the light to be visible and actually volumetric. So now it has a center. And I'm going to increase the outer distance of the light and maybe increase the inner distance a little bit so we have a more solid core. And look how this material is being interacted with the light. So you can create some really amazing things with the alpha channel. And again, that's options for invert, soft, which puts kind of a blurred edge on there. So if I turn this off, it's also going to flip it. So I'm going to turn this to invert off. So now you'll see if I take off soft, I get a harder edge on here. That can be combated with the anti-aliasing settings turned up to where it's actually impacting the the texture, and so you can get some smoother but still crisp edges on your alpha channels. So the alpha channel is really cool. It's also great for how we can mix textures together, and we're going to look at that in the next video. And so now we have the glow, which you can probably imagine what that does. You have an inner strength and an outer strength for the glow, and you by default it will use the material color. Just turn off interactive render region. Render this. I forgot I had a light in my scene. That's messing things up. So you can see here if I kind of pull this up a little bit and out, we'll begin to see that show up. So this can be set to any color if you don't want to use the material color. It could be white. Maybe turn down that inner strength. And typically, you know, subtle values are a little bit more effective than, you know, crazy high glow values. And so you can kind of just play around with that, but a very cool effect. And so that's kind of a rundown of the different channels, the different options we have. In the next video, we'll actually take a look at building a few materials and see how you can combine materials onto an object to create some great textures.